In the popular imagination, the medieval tavern is a place of flickering candlelight, rowdy brawls, and mysterious strangers sitting in dark corners. While that makes for great fantasy, the reality of medieval hospitality was far more regulated, socially stratified, and diverse. To understand the world of medieval hospitality, we first have to distinguish between the three main establishments: the alehouse, the tavern, and the inn.
The humblest of these was the alehouse. Unlike a modern pub, an alehouse was often just someone's private home. In medieval villages and towns, brewing was a domestic task, primarily handled by women, known as alewives or brewsters. When an alewife finished a particularly successful batch of ale, she would hang an ale stake, a long pole with a bunch of ivy or brush at the end, outside her door. This signaled to the neighborhood that fresh ale was available. Inside, the atmosphere was intimate and informal. There were no bars to stand at. You sat on benches around the family's kitchen table. Alehouses rarely served food other than bread or perhaps a bit of cheese, and they almost never provided lodging. These were local haunts where neighbors gathered to gossip, play dice, and escape the smoke of their own hearths. Because ale was perishable and had no hops to preserve it, it had to be consumed quickly, making the alehouse the social heartbeat of the common people. Moving up the social ladder, we find the tavern. While the alehouse was for the commoner, the tavern was the domain of the emerging middle class and the wealthy. In many regions, particularly in England, taverns were strictly prohibited from brewing their own beer. Instead, they were specialized establishments licensed to sell wine. Wine was an expensive import from places like Gascony or the Rhineland, which meant the clientele included merchants, lawyers, and government officials. Taverns were more sophisticated than alehouses, often featuring vintners who understood the aging and storage of fine wines. They were frequently located in cellars to keep the wine at a constant temperature. While you could get a meal in a tavern, usually a meat pie or a roast, it was still primarily a place for drinking and business. Much like a modern coffee shop or wine bar, the tavern was where deals were struck and contracts were signed.
Finally, at the top of the hierarchy was the inn. The medieval inn was the equivalent of a grand hotel. These were substantial buildings, often built around a central courtyard, with stables for horses and large warehouses for trade goods. In an era where travel was dangerous and slow, inns were essential infrastructure for pilgrims, royal messengers, and wealthy merchants. Unlike alehouses or taverns, an inn provided the full package: food, drink, and a place to sleep. However, privacy was a foreign concept. Unless you were a high-ranking noble who could afford to rent an entire room, you were likely sharing a bed. It was perfectly normal for 3 or 4 strangers to be tucked into the same large bedstead. To the medieval mind, this wasn't strange. It was a way to share warmth and stay safe. The beds themselves were stuffed with straw or, in the better establishments, feathers, and were covered with heavy wool blankets to ward off the damp.
The food at an inn was served table d'hôte, or at a common table. There was no menu to order from. You ate whatever the innkeeper had prepared that day. This usually meant a great pottage, or a mess of meat and vegetables cooked in a massive cauldron over the central fire. In high-end inns, you might see roasted capons, venison, or freshwater fish, all heavily seasoned with expensive spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger to show off the establishment's wealth. However, the hospitality industry was not a lawless frontier. It was one of the most heavily regulated sectors of medieval life. Local officials, known as ale tasters, would visit alehouses to ensure the brew was of sufficient quality and sold at the legally fixed price. If an alewife sold corrupt ale or used a short measure mug, she could be fined or even placed in the cumbrous cucking stool to be publicly shamed. Inns and taverns also had to navigate the hue and cry. Because they hosted travelers from far-off lands, innkeepers were legally responsible for the behavior of their guests. They had to record who stayed with them, and if a guest committed a crime and fled, the innkeeper could be held liable. To prevent shadowy characters from plotting, many towns had a curfew. Once the church bell rang the ignitagem, the cover fire bell, or curfew, taverns were supposed to shut their doors and extinguish their lights.
For those who couldn't afford an inn, there was another option: the monastery. Religious houses were obligated by the rule of Saint Benedict to provide hospitality to any traveler who knocked on their door. They had separate guest houses for this purpose. While the stay was technically free, it was expected that wealthy travelers would leave a significant donation, while the poor might offer labor in exchange for a floor to sleep on and a bowl of monastic pottage. As the Middle Ages progressed toward the Renaissance, these establishments began to merge. The introduction of hops in the 14th and 15th centuries revolutionized the industry. Hops acted as a preservative, allowing beer to be transported and stored for longer periods. This led to the rise of the public house, a precursor to the modern pub, which combined the local social feel of the alehouse with the professional services of the tavern.
Whether it was a merchant sipping spiced claret in a London tavern or a tired pilgrim sharing a bed in a Canterbury inn, these spaces were the vital crossroads of the medieval world. They were the only places where people from different walks of life, monks, soldiers, traders, and peasants might actually sit at the same table and share a story. Thanks for joining me at the tavern today. If you enjoyed this look at where medieval people kicked back and relaxed, give that like button a tap and subscribe for more deep dives into history. What's your pick? A quiet night at a monastery or a rowdy evening in a village alehouse? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next one.